The first rays of the morning sun stretched across the horizon, painting the small village in shades of gold and orange. A gentle mist still clung to the thatched rooftops, dissipating slowly as the warmth of the new day settled in. The air was crisp, but beneath it something else stirred, a rich, mouth-watering aroma that curled through the winding dirt roads and into every home. It was the smell of Amar's food. One by one, the villagers stirred awake. A young boy, barely 7, lifted his small nose into the air, inhaling deeply. His stomach growled, and his eyes fluttered open with excitement. Not far from him, a farmer stretched his muscular arms, the scent already drawing him out of bed before his wife could even protest. From the narrow doorways of mud brick houses, women wrapped in colourful Ankara fabrics stepped out, drawn by an invisible pull. Children rushed ahead, their bare feet kicking up dust as they ran toward the heart of the village. Traders, elders, and even visitors who had arrived just the night before followed suit, their stomachs betraying their curiosity. At the center of it all stood Amar's small food stand, a simple wooden structure beneath the shade of an ancient baobab tree. Wisps of smoke curled from her clay pot, the bubbling stew inside rich, thick, and almost hypnotic in its allure. Amar stood over it, her worn hands stirring with practiced ease, her expression one of calm confidence. The villagers gathered, eyes wide, mouths watering. No one truly understood why her food was so irresistible. They only knew that once they tasted it, they craved more. And today would be no different. The marketplace bustled with life. The golden morning sun cast long shadows over the packed dirt roads, where women in vibrant wrappers balanced trays of fresh vegetables on their heads. The scent of fried plantains and smoked fish filled the air as customers haggled over prices, their voices blending into a lively chorus. But amidst the cheer, Mama Emika sat in front of her food stall, staring at Amar's stand with narrowed eyes. Her own stall, once the pride of the village, was almost empty. The wooden benches she had scrubbed daily now sat cold and untouched. The pots that once bubbled with her famous egusi soup were silent. Yet Amar's stall, barely larger than a makeshift hut, had a line stretching down the street. Mama Emika clenched her fists. It didn't make sense. Amar had only one small pot, one wooden ladle, and a single clay bowl for serving. She never seemed to run out of food, and no one ever saw her buy ingredients. Mama Emika glanced down at the few leftover pieces of roasted yam on her stall. Even her most loyal customers had abandoned her. Her gaze returned to Amar. The old woman was serving with her usual mysterious smile, her hands moving with unnatural grace as she scooped food from the seemingly endless pot. The people in line took their first bites, and their faces melted into pure bliss. Mama Emika's heart pounded. She knew the taste of good food, but this was something else. A woman in line, a young mother with a baby tied to her back, bit into a piece of steaming hot fufu and soup. Her eyes glazed over. For a moment she stood still, swaying slightly before letting out a slow sigh, a look of deep satisfaction spreading across her face. Mama Emika swallowed hard. That wasn't normal. She tore her gaze away and turned to Amaka, another food seller, whose stall was also nearly empty. "You see that?" she whispered. Amaka followed her gaze. She too had noticed something strange. "Yes," Amaka murmured. "I don't understand it. It's like—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's like they don't just enjoy the food, they need it." Mama Emika exhaled shakily. She had to know the truth. Tonight she would follow Amar, and she would find out where the old woman's food truly came from. The village had gone quiet. The once bustling marketplace was now a shadow of itself, its stalls abandoned, the remnants of the day's trade scattered across the dirt roads, banana peels, broken clay bowls, and the faint scent of roasted fish lingering in the air. A half-moon hung in the sky, casting pale silver light over the village huts, their thatched roofs whispering in the cool breeze. Mama Emika pressed her back against the mud wall of a nearby hut, her breath slow and measured. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had been watching Amar all day, waiting. Now, At the hour when only owls and restless spirits roamed, the old woman finally emerged from her hut. Amma stepped into the dim moonlight, her thin frame wrapped in a dark blue wrapper, her grey-streaked hair now fully hidden beneath a tattered black scarf. Her posture was as calm and graceful as ever, but there was something different about her movements. She was moving with purpose, and she was carrying a small covered clay pot. Mama Emika's throat went dry. Where was Amma going so late in the night? And what was in that pot? Carefully, she slipped into the shadows, keeping a safe distance as she followed. Amma walked past the empty marketplace, her sandals making no sound against the dirt path. She moved like a shadow, blending into the night. She did not take the road toward the village farmlands. She did not take the path leading to the river. Instead, she took the road that led to a place no one dared go at night, the village mortuary. Mama Emika's blood turned to ice. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. The moon hung low, casting an eerie silver glow on the narrow dirt path leading away from the village. Crickets chirped in the distance, their song blending with the rustling of the banana leaves. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something rotten. Mama Emika's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she crouched behind a thick cluster of plantain trees. Her heart pounded wildly against her chest. She had followed Amma for nearly an hour, weaving through the outskirts of the village and into the shadowy grove beyond. Now she watched in horror as Amma knelt beside an old wooden bucket filled with inky black water, water that carried the scent of death. A thin mist curled from the bucket's surface. Amma dipped her wrinkled fingers into the liquid, swirling it gently. Then, in a low, guttural voice, she began to chant. Mama Emika's stomach twisted. She could feel it, the unnatural pull of something ancient, something dark. And then, "Why do you follow me, Emika?" Mama Emika gasped. Amma hadn't turned around. She hadn't even looked up, but she knew. Slowly, deliberately, Amma rose to her feet, her frail frame eerily steady. She lifted the bucket and turned. Her deep brown eyes, normally filled with warmth when serving food, were now cold and knowing. A thin smile played on her cracked lips. "You should not have seen this," Amma murmured, stepping forward. Mama Emika staggered back, but Amma moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them. The night air seemed to thicken, pressing down on Mama Emika's lungs. "I know what you do," Mama Emika spat. "You use this filth to cook for the villagers." Amma chuckled softly, shaking her head. "And yet, they eat, they crave, they return." Her voice was like silk, smooth and hypnotic. "Even you, Mama Emika, once licked your fingers after tasting my stew." Mama Emika shuddered. It was true. Amma's food had been unlike anything she had ever eaten. Richer, fuller, as if it had been cooked with the essence of life itself. But now, knowing the truth, her stomach churned. "I will expose you," she hissed. Amma sighed, setting down the bucket with a soft thud. "Oh, Emika." Amma clicked her tongue. "You should not have seen this." Before Mama Emika could react, Amma's wrinkled hands shot out with terrifying speed. She gripped Mama Emika's shoulders, fingers like iron claws, and forced her to her knees. A clay bowl appeared in Amma's hands, filled with steaming, rich red stew. The aroma was intoxicating, thick with spices and something else, something wrong. Mama Emika screamed, struggling, but Amma's grip was unbreakable. "Eat," Amma commanded, her voice low and absolute. Mama Emika clamped her lips shut, shaking her head wildly. Amma's smile never wavered. With one swift movement, she pressed her long fingers against Mama Emika's jaw, forcing it open. The hot stew burned as Amma shoved a spoonful into her mouth. Mama Emika gagged. The moment the food touched her tongue, a wave of pleasure rushed through her body. It was delicious. No, it was exquisite. Her mind swam in bliss, her senses overwhelmed. And then, her eyes widened, her stomach twisted violently. She clawed at her throat, trying to scream, but her voice failed her. Her skin turned clammy, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. A low, strangled sound escaped her lips. Amma watched as Mama Emika convulsed, her body racked with unseen forces, watched as her eyes rolled back, as her veins darkened beneath her skin. And then, silence. Mama Emika slumped forward, motionless. Amma sighed, brushing her hands together as if dusting them off. She picked up her bucket. The night swallowed her whole. The morning sun rose lazily over the village, casting long golden beams through the mist. Roosters crowed in the distance, goats bleated, and the faint chatter of market vendors setting up their stalls filled the air. The village square, usually alive with the scent of different meals cooking, now carried only one overpowering aroma, the unmistakable scent of Amar's food. A long line of villagers stretched before Amar's humble food stand, eager for their share of her irresistible meals. The clatter of wooden bowls and metal spoons echoed as Amar served each person with the same slow, deliberate motion, her aged hands never trembling. But something was wrong. Across the market, Mama Emika's stall remained empty. The place where she once stood, arguing over the price of plantains and laughing with customers, was silent. The wooden table, usually filled with steaming pots, lay bare, gathering dust. Amara, dressed in her deep green wrapper with brown tribal prints, stood behind her own food stall, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her almond-shaped eyes, sharp and calculating, darted toward Amma. Something felt off. Mama Emika would never abandon her business, not without a word, not without a reason. Amaka's fingers tightened around the wooden spoon in her hand. A small bead of sweat rolled down her temple. The unease in her stomach had nothing to do with hunger. She needed answers. As the crowd thinned, she wiped her hands on her wrapper and took slow, deliberate steps toward Amma's stall. Amara stopped a few feet away from Amma's stall. "Morning, Amma," she greeted cautiously. Amma barely glanced up, her ladle dipping into the steaming pot. "Morning, child," she replied smoothly. "Come for a taste?" Amara's stomach churned. She had eaten Amma's food before, but today, knowing what she suspected, she could almost feel the wrongness in the air. She forced a smile. "Not today." She hesitated before adding, "Have you seen Mama Emika?" For the first time, Amma paused mid-motion. It was only for a second, but Amara noticed. Then Amma let out a slow, breathy laugh. "You worry too much, Amara. Emika is an old woman. Maybe she went to visit family." Amara stared hard at Amma's face. Something was hidden behind those aged eyes. Something dark. And then she saw it. Just for a moment, Amma's fingers tightened around the ladle, her knuckles turning white. She was lying. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. The air inside her hut was thick, humid, suffocating. The rhythmic croaking of frogs and distant hoots of owls did little to calm her unease. Mama Emika was gone, and Amma had lied. She sat up on her wooden mat, beads of sweat on her forehead. Then she made her decision. She would follow Amma. Grabbing a small lantern, she wrapped her wrapper tightly around her and stepped out into the night. The village was silent, the once lively market now a dark, empty maze of abandoned stalls. The moon cast long, eerie shadows, stretching across the dirt road. Then she saw it. Amma moving silently, her old frame unnaturally fast, heading toward the forest path. Amara's breath hitched. She swallowed her fear and followed. The night breeze whispered through the trees as Amara followed Amma into the darkness. Every step she took was careful, her bare feet pressing into the cool earth, her breathing shallow. She had to see where Amma was going. The deeper they went into the forest, the thicker the trees became, their twisted branches forming a dark tunnel overhead. The air smelled different here, damp, old, almost rotten. Amma moved swiftly, her aged frame oddly nimble, disappearing behind a thicket of banana trees. Then Amara saw it. A wooden hut, old and covered in creeping vines, stood in a clearing. A large clay pot bubbled outside, its thick black liquid letting out an eerie glow in the moonlight. Bones, dried herbs, and strange markings surrounded the entrance. Amarka's stomach turned. This was no ordinary hut. Then, Amma did something that sent shivers down Amarka's spine. She lifted a small wooden bowl from inside the pot, filled it with the black liquid, and poured it into a large water gourd, the same type she used every morning to prepare her food. Amarka covered her mouth to stop a gasp. It was true. Amma's food was cursed. Amarka turned to leave, but her foot snapped a dry twig. Crack! Amma's head snapped up. The old woman froze, her wrinkled eyes narrowing. "Who is there?" Amarka's heart pounded. She held her breath, pressing herself against the trunk of a tree. Amma listened for a long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she turned back to her hut. Amarka didn't wait. She ran. By the time Amarka reached the village, the first streaks of dawn were creeping over the rooftops. Sweat dripped from her forehead, her heart still racing. She burst into the king's palace, startling the guards. "I need to speak to the king," she panted. "It's Amma. She's using dark magic." The guards exchanged uneasy glances. "Amarka, go home. You are tired." "No, listen to me," she cried. Enough." A deep, commanding voice echoed through the hall. Amarka turned. A tall, powerful figure stepped into the morning light. The traveling pastor, Pastor Jeremiah. His presence commanded respect. The guards immediately stepped aside. "You say Amma is using dark magic." His voice was calm, but there was power in it. Amarka nodded. "I saw it with my own eyes." The pastor studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Take me to her." As the sun rose, a small crowd gathered. The pastor, followed by Amarka, the village guards, and a growing number of curious villagers, walked toward Amma's stall. When they arrived, Amma was already serving food. She looked up, her aged face calm, but her fingers trembled slightly. "Pastor," she greeted, her voice steady, "what brings you here?" The pastor took a deep breath, staring at her deeply. "I have come to pray." Amma's smile faltered. The crowd whispered, their voices rippling with confusion and unease. Then the pastor raised his hands and began to pray. His voice was deep, commanding, and filled with power. Amma's hands began to shake. The pots around her rattled. The ground beneath them trembled. And then she screamed. Her body twisted, her eyes turning white, and dark smoke began to rise from her skin. The villagers gasped in horror as Amma fell to her knees, her secret finally revealed. The air was thick, charged with something unnatural. Amma collapsed onto the ground, her breath ragged, her body trembling as thick black smoke coiled from her skin like living tendrils. The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale with terror. The pastor's voice boomed, his prayers cracking through the silence. "Confess, Amma," he commanded. She clawed at the dirt, her aged face twisting in pain. Then, in a voice unlike her own, low, guttural, almost inhuman, she spoke. I fed them death." A horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. Pastor Jeremiah stepped forward, his eyes fierce. "What have you done?" Amma let out a chilling laugh, but her body was weakening. Her skin, once firm despite her age, began to wrinkle further, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. "I took the water," she hissed, "from the dead." The villagers staggered back, horror dawning on their faces. She lifted a shaking finger, pointing at the large blackened water gourd beside her stall. "The mortuary," she wheezed. "The water from their bodies. I used it. I mixed it with prayers, and they could never resist." A woman in the crowd dropped her bowl, the food spilling onto the ground. A few villagers vomited, realization hitting them like a blow to the stomach. Mama Emika's husband fell to his knees, his face twisted in anguish. "My wife, she tried to tell us, and now she is dead." The wind howled through the village, whipping up dust and dried leaves. Ammar's body began to wither before their very eyes, as if something was draining the very life from her. Pastor Jeremiah held his golden cross high. It is over, he declared. But Amma's eyes burned with something else, something deeper, something ancient. She let out a final, bone-chilling whisper. You will all remember me. Then her body crumbled into dust. The villagers screamed. The ground where she lay blackened, charred as if scorched by hellfire. And just like that, Amar was gone. But the village would never be the same again. The village elder stepped forward, his face filled with grief and rage. All this time, he whispered, we have been eating cursed food. The villagers looked at one another, horror dawning. Some clutched their stomachs, others collapsed onto the ground, sobbing. Amaka stepped forward, her voice shaking. Mama Emika. She tried to stop Amma, and Amma killed her for it. A silence fell over the village. Then, one by one, the villagers began to burn Ammar's food stall. The flames crackled, sending thick black smoke into the air. It smelled wrong, not like burning wood, like something deeper, darker. The elders decreed a cleansing ritual, a 3-day fast, prayers at the river, offerings to cleanse their bodies. And on the third night, something happened. The ground where Amma had died split open. A strange, dark root burst from the earth, twisting toward the sky. Something unnatural had taken hold. The villagers fled, praying harder than ever before. And though Amma was gone, her evil had left its mark. Even today, the village speaks of the cursed stall, the forbidden food, and the woman who fed them death.